There's a category of transaction in professional hockey that defies easy classification as either good or bad. Deals that simultaneously represent organizational failure on both sides of the table, where the buyer overpays for something they do not need, and the seller undersells something they cannot afford to lose. The Bobby McMann trade between Toronto and Seattle belongs in that category. And the fact that both front offices will spend the coming months constructing narratives about why their respective decisions made strategic sense does not change the fundamental reality that this transaction produced no genuine winners. Only two organizations that failed to accurately assess their own competitive identities at the precise moment that accurate self-assessment was most urgently required. Bobby McMann Seattle Kraken trade 2026. Let us begin with the return Toronto received, because the numbers demand direct confrontation before any analytical framework can be responsibly applied. A second-round pick in 2027. A fourth-round pick in 2026. That is a complete inventory of assets Brad Treliving extracted from the Seattle Kraken in exchange for a player producing at a pace that projects to 25 goals across a full season, who stands 6 feet 2 inches tall, weighs 105 kilograms, and who brings a physical competitive dimension to his game that is genuinely rare among forwards producing at that offensive level. The market context that makes this return so analytically damning is not abstract or subject to interpretation. Corey Perry, 40 years old, operating at a fraction of McMahon's physical capacity, contributing at a level that reflects a player in the final functional chapter of a long career, commanded a second-round pick from a franchise that wanted his veteran presence. Toronto received that same second-round pick for a player in his physical prime, producing at nearly double Perry's offensive output, with multiple years of competitive relevance ahead of him. NHL Trade Deadline Forward Market Value Comparison 2026. The Perry parallel is not rhetorical decoration. It is a precise market calibration that exposes the magnitude of Toronto's negotiating failure. When the asset you are selling is objectively superior in every measurable dimension, age, physical profile, offensive production, contract value, competitive ceiling, to another asset that's sold for equivalent return in the same market window, the conclusion is unavoidable. Either the selling organization failed to generate competitive bidding interest that would have driven the price to an accurate reflection of market value, or the selling organization was operating under deadline pressure severe enough to accept a below-market return rather than risk receiving nothing. In Toronto's case, the evidence strongly suggests the latter. The organizational desperation that had been accumulating across weeks of losing, roster dysfunction, and public crisis reached its terminal expression in a transaction that prioritized the certainty of any return over the discipline of holding for appropriate value. NHL Trade Deadline Asset Valuation Market Efficiency. The fourth-round pick included in the package deserves specific examination because it functions as the most honest single data point in this entire transaction. Fourth-round selections in the NHL draft are developmental lottery tickets, assets that occasionally produce useful NHL contributors, but that convert into genuine roster players at rates that make them the least reliable form of currency in the league's asset exchange system. The historical conversion rate of fourth-round picks into players who contribute meaningfully at the NHL level is low enough that their inclusion in any significant transaction represents either a negotiating afterthought or a face-saving addition designed to allow the selling team to describe a two-piece return rather than acknowledge that the primary asset constituted the entire substance of the deal. In the McMann transaction, the fourth-round pick is not compensation. It is decoration on a package that was already insufficient before it was added. NHL draft pick conversion rates by round historical data. Now, the Seattle dimension of this analysis, because Jason Botterill's front office deserves equal scrutiny for a different category of organizational error. The Kraken's acquisition of McMann reflect a fundamental misreading of what their roster actually requires at this stage of the franchise's competitive development. A misreading so structurally significant that it reveals either a genuine philosophical confusion about the team's competitive identity or a front office making decisions based on deadline availability rather than roster-building logic. Seattle Kraken roster construction 2026 analysis. Seattle's competitive problem is not depth. The Kraken do not lose hockey games because their third and fourth lines lack physical presence or board battle competitiveness. They lose hockey games because the top of their roster does not generate offensive production at a level that creates the separation required to compete consistently with the Eastern Conference's elite franchises. The forwards leading Seattle's attack have not consistently performed at a first-line level that drives genuine playoff contention. Adding McMahon to a roster with that specific deficiency does not address the deficiency. It creates a more physically credible version of the same structurally limited team, a franchise that can now grind to the lower portions of a playoff series before being eliminated by an opponent whose superior top-end talent simply outproduces them across 7 games regardless of how competitive the physical battle becomes. The Formula One tires on a standard vehicle analogy captures something real about the logical failure embedded in Seattle's approach. McMahon's value, the specific competitive advantage he provides, is maximized when he operates as a third-line contributor on a roster whose first and second lines are capable of generating enough offensive production to make the opposition worry primarily about stopping the top of the lineup. In that context, McMahon's physical presence in the lineup's middle and lower thirds creates genuinely disruptive consequences for opposing defensive systems, because those systems cannot afford to commit their primary defensive resources to containing him when far more dangerous offensive threats are operating above him. Strip away those more dangerous threats. Place McMahon on a roster where the top of the lineup is not capable of commanding that primary defensive attention, and his physical effectiveness is partially neutralized by the simple reality that opponents can direct more resources toward managing him without paying a meaningful offensive cost for doing so. NHL forward line role optimization team construction. The karma dimension that the McMahon transaction imposes on Toronto's playoff prospects is where the analysis arrives at its most uncomfortable conclusion for the Maple Leafs faithful. The front office spent the weeks preceding the deadline publicly and privately identifying physical depth and competitive edge as the organizational deficiencies most urgently requiring correction. The Lawton acquisition from Philadelphia the previous year was explicitly positioned as a response to that identified deficiency. The organizational communication surrounding Toronto's roster construction consistently referenced the need for players capable of winning the physical battles that playoff hockey demands. And then, in the final hours of the deadline, the front office packaged and shipped the player who most authentically embodied those characteristics in exchange for a second-round pick and a fourth-round afterthought. The April consequences of that decision will not be distributed across the abstract future. They will arrive in specific, concrete, game-by-game increments as Toronto attempts to navigate playoff hockey without the physical presence it acknowledged needing and then deliberately removed. The opposing teams that Toronto might face in the postseason will not be constrained by the organizational narratives Trailerving deploys in press conferences. They will be constrained only by what is actual on the ice opposing them. And what will be on the ice opposing them will be a Toronto roster that has been systematically stripped of its physical competitive identity across a deadline period that prioritized draft capital accumulation over the competitive tools required to survive postseason hockey. NHL playoff physical attrition third, fourth line impact. The draft capital framing that Toronto's front office will use to justify the McMahon transaction. The argument that accumulating picks represents responsible long-term planning and provides organizational flexibility for future roster construction, collapses when subjected to honest competitive timeline analysis. The Auston Matthews window is not a 10-year horizon. It is a compressed period of competitive relevance that is already contracting with each passing season of playoff failure. The picks acquired through McMahon's trade will not produce NHL-ready players in time to contribute to a Matthews-era championship pursuit. They will mature into prospects during a developmental timeline that extends well beyond the competitive window those picks were theoretically acquired to eventually support. The organization is cashing in present-tense competitive assets for future-tense development resources at exactly the moment when the present tense is expiring. NHL competitive window, timeline draft development lag. There's a version of the McMahon trade that makes organizational sense, and it is worth articulating honestly rather than dismissing entirely. If Toronto has genuinely concluded, at the executive level, with clear-eyed honesty rather than defensive rationalization, that the current Coors championship window has closed, that the roster around Matthews and company is not capable of producing a playoff run regardless of which complementary pieces are retained, and that the most responsible stewardship of the franchise involves beginning the asset accumulation that will eventually support a genuine competitive rebuild, then moving. McMahon for picks represents logical consistency with that conclusion. The problem is that this conclusion has never been publicly stated, never been honestly communicated to the fan base, and is fundamentally inconsistent with the organizational rhetoric that has simultaneously suggested Toronto remains in a competitive window, requiring aggressive short-term decision-making. NHL, rebuild commitment, organizational honesty, fan-base communication. You cannot simultaneously be a franchise committed to winning now and a franchise rationally accumulating draft capital by trading current contributors. These are philosophically incompatible organizational positions, and attempting to occupy both simultaneously produces exactly the kind of incoherent deadline behavior that the McMahon transaction represents. Toronto sold a competitive asset at a below-market price without the honest organizational context that would make that sale comprehensible as a strategic decision rather than a panic response. Seattle bought a complementary piece without the roster foundation that would make that piece competitively meaningful. The market operated at its least efficient, and both franchises will spend the next several years living with the consequences of decisions made in the final hours of a deadline that found both organizations without sufficient clarity about what they actually needed. NHL trade deadline organizational clarity decision-making. A fourth-round pick does not block an opposing winger along the board in April. It does not win a puck battle behind the net in overtime of a playoff game. It does not provide the locker room with the physical accountability that changes how opponents approach the final two periods of a competitive series. Bobby McMahon did all of those things, every night, for a salary that represented one of the best values on the entire roster. He is now doing them in Seattle, for a franchise that needed something different, acquired by a front office that confused availability with fit. And Toronto heads into the playoff stretch carrying a roster lighter, softer, and more financially complicated than the one McMahon's presence helped stabilize, with a second-round pick in 2027 and a fourth-round selection as the organizational compensation for that sacrifice. The ice does not grade on intention. It grades on what shows up to compete. Sound off below, because this transaction deserves a verdict from the people who watch this team with the kind of passion that organizational decisions as consequential genuinely affect.